In the brutal heat of the Arizona desert, 1875, Etsali, an Apache girl on the run, gasped for breath as she stumbled through the barren land. Blood soaked her tunic, and her body was weak from days of running, betrayed by her own people, and hunted by both Apache warriors and the white man's bounty hunters. With every step, the sounds of hooves grew louder, and fear twisted her insides like a cruel knot. She collapsed, eyes darting frantically for a way out, but the sand seemed to swallow all hope. In that desperate moment, she wondered if she'd ever, another sunrise, or if the desert would claim her first. Before we continue, if you're watching this from anywhere in the world, leave your city name in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Dante Calloway, a young black rancher, was used to the silence of the desert. But that day, the quiet was shattered by the crack of a gunshot. His heart skipped a beat. There was no cattle rustler or wild animal that could cause such a noise out here. This was something else. A cry for help, maybe. A warning. Dante nudged his horse, Dust Devil, into a faster pace. He'd been on this stretch of land 100 times, but today it felt different. He could feel something was coming. As he crested a rise in the land, his eyes caught the faintest glimpse of movement far below. He urged the horse forward, his mind racing. The stench hit him first. Metallic, sharp, blood. And then he saw her. A young woman, an Apache girl, sprawled on the ground, barely clinging to life. She was bleeding from a deep wound on her side, her face pale, streaked with dirt and sweat. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was shallow. Dante's heart hammered in his chest. He dismounted quickly, dropping the reins as Dust Devil stood still, sensing the danger. Dante knelt beside the girl, his calloused hands trembling as he reached for her pulse. It was weak, but it was there. His mind raced, his instincts kicking in. He couldn't leave her. He knew what she was, an Apache, and he knew the risks of saving her. But something in him, some deep, unspoken part of his soul, told him it was the right thing to do. "Hold on, girl," he muttered, his voice rough, filled with uncertainty. "I ain't leaving you here." He didn't know why he spoke to her, why he cared. He'd been raised with the idea that people like her were nothing more than savages. His entire life he'd been taught to distrust them, to fear them. But this wasn't about what he'd been taught. This was about something deeper, something human. With a groan, the girl's eyes fluttered open, hazy and unfocused. She looked at him, confusion and fear clouding her features. Her hand instinctively reached for the knife at her side, but her strength faltered, and her hand fell back to the dirt. You gonna kill me?" Her voice was weak, barely a whisper. Dante's chest tightened. He wanted to say something to ease her fear, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply shook his head. "No," he said softly. "I'm not gonna kill you, but you gotta trust me. I'm helping you." Her eyes narrowed, disbelief flickering in her gaze. He could see it in her eyes, the defiance, the suspicion. She was Apache after all. His people were her enemy. She had every right to mistrust him. But he wasn't like the others. He wasn't like the men who'd hunted her people, burned their villages, and taken everything they had. He wasn't like the men who had taught him that it was either them or us. Dante's heart ached as he placed a hand on her forehead, pushing her hair back gently. She flinched at first, but then her body relaxed slightly. "Don't worry. I'm not going to hurt you," he said again, his voice steadier now, more confident. "I'm just trying to help." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world felt still, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, the girl's lips parted, her words barely audible. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking with the pain. "Why are you helping me?" Dante paused, looking down at her, unsure of how to answer. He could tell her the truth, that he didn't know, that it didn't make sense and that he wasn't supposed to care. But in that moment, he did. He couldn't explain it, but the girl's pain, her vulnerability, called to something deep inside him. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. "I don't know why," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't just leave you here." For the first time, he saw something shift in her eyes. Not fear, not hatred, but something closer to acceptance. She closed her eyes, her body trembling as she fought to stay conscious. Dante quickly removed his jacket and folded it beneath her head, trying to ease her discomfort. His hands moved swiftly, but with care, as he worked to clean her wounds. Every touch felt like it mattered, like it was the first step in undoing years of hatred, years of bloodshed. But the desert had a way of stripping everything down to the bone. It didn't care who you were, where you came from, or what you believed. It only cared about survival. And in this moment, all Dante cared about was keeping her alive. She was his responsibility now, whether she liked it or not. And he wasn't about to let her die alone in the desert. Dante had never been one to shy away from a fight. But this was different. The weight of his decision to save Etsali felt like a stone in his chest, pressing down harder with each passing minute. She was Apache, a member of a tribe that had been at war with his people for generations. And yet here she was, a bleeding, broken soul that he couldn't just leave to die. He had never been good with words, but with her unconscious in his arms, he had to find a way to keep her alive, to keep her from slipping away. The journey from the desert floor to a safer place was long and brutal. Dante's mind raced with questions. What had happened to her? Why was she alone? Was she running from her own people? The thought gnawed at him as he pushed forward. He couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not now. She was his responsibility, and that was all that mattered. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the temperature dropped. The air was cool, but the dryness of the desert still lingered, biting at his skin. Dante's body ached, his muscles sore from carrying her. But he kept moving, every step driven by the need to keep her alive. By nightfall, they found shelter in the shade of a small canyon. Dante made a small fire, his hands trembling slightly as he worked to get the flames going. He had no idea what to do next. He wasn't a doctor, and this girl was the last person he ever thought he'd be looking after. Yet here they were. Etsali stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She winced, clutching her side as the pain set in again. "You're still alive," Dante said quietly, his voice rough from the exhaustion. Her gaze flickered to him, filled with suspicion. "Why? Why are you helping me?" Her voice was hoarse, but the defiance was still there, like a flicker of a fire that refused to be snuffed out. Dante sighed and rubbed his face, the weight of the question settling deep in his gut. He didn't have a good answer. He had no idea why he was helping her. He didn't owe her anything. They were enemies. But in that moment, as he looked down at her, something inside him told him it was the right thing to do. "Because you're not just a nameless enemy to me," he said, his voice quieter now, full of something that felt like regret, mixed with the weight of his decision. "And I'm not about to let you die out here in the desert." Etsali's gaze softened slightly, but there was still a hardness there, the remnants of years of conflict. She didn't trust him. How could she? She had every right not to. But as the hours passed, she remained silent, letting Dante tend to her wounds. His hands were steady, though his mind was racing. There were so many questions he couldn't answer. Was it really mercy that drove him? Or was it something else? Something he wasn't ready to face? The fire crackled softly in the still night air, the only sound between them. Eventually, Etsali spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "I've seen what men like you can do, what your kind does to mine." Dante felt the sting of her words like a slap across the face. He knew what she meant. He wasn't blind. He'd heard the stories, the massacres, the betrayal, the years of bloodshed between their people. "I'm not like them," he said, more forcefully than he meant to. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration and guilt surging up in him. "I can't speak for what they've done, but I can tell you, I won't be part of it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Etsali turned her head away, her face shadowed by the flickering light of the fire. Dante looked at her, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't just hate. It was doubt. Maybe even a flicker of hope. He could feel it, an invisible thread pulling them together, an unspoken understanding. They were still enemies in every sense of the word, but they were also something more now. They were two people, thrown together by fate, struggling to survive in a world that had no place for either of them. The night stretched on, and Dante sat by the fire, watching her as she drifted back to sleep. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, and he knew the road ahead was going to be filled with danger. But in that moment, for the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing the right thing. The days that followed were a blur of heat and dust. Dante and Etsali moved through the desert like shadows, always a step ahead of the dangers that seemed to follow them at every turn. They had no clear plan, no direction except survival. Each night, they camped in whatever shelter they could find, an old barn, a shallow cave, or beneath the open sky if they had no other choice. Dante carried most of the weight, not just the physical burden of carrying Etsali when she was too weak to walk, but the mental strain of knowing that the Apache girl he was helping had every reason to kill him, and that others would want him dead for helping her. One morning, after a restless night of little sleep, Etsali sat up, her hand clutching her side. The wound was still raw and tender, but it had stopped bleeding. Her eyes met Dante's, and for the first time since their chance encounter, he saw something in her gaze that wasn't filled with mistrust. It was curiosity, the faintest hint of trust. "How long are we going to keep running?" she asked, her voice strained but steady. Dante paused, his mind grappling with the question. He didn't have an answer. What could he say? They had no destination, no refuge. He wasn't a wanderer. He was a rancher, a man who had always been rooted to the land. But now, the land he had known felt like a vast, empty expanse, stretching on forever with no safe place for either of them. "We'll keep moving until we find a place to stop," Dante said finally, his tone a mix of frustration and resolve. He wasn't sure if that place even existed. "How will we know?" Etsali pressed, her voice softer this time, as if she too was starting to feel the weight of their journey, the endless stretch of desert that seemed to swallow them whole. Dante turned to look at her, his eyes narrowing as he thought about the question. He had no answers, no plans, only instincts that told him to keep moving, keep surviving. He felt like a man running from a storm, unable to see where the winds would take him. And yet, despite it all, there was something inside him that couldn't turn away. "I don't know," he said, his voice low, "but I do know this. We can't stop now. Not after all this." Etsali said nothing in response, but her expression softened. For a brief moment, she wasn't the fierce Apache warrior. She was just a girl, young, scared, and lost in the same way he was. As the days wore on, their conversations began to shift. They spoke less about survival and more about who they were, what had brought them to this point. Etsali told him stories of her people, of her father, the great chief of the Chiricahua Apache, and the constant battle to hold on to their land. Her voice was fierce when she spoke of her tribe's honor, and there was a fire in her eyes that Dante couldn't ignore. But there was also sorrow, an ache that told of loss, a loss she hadn't spoken of fully yet. Dante, in turn, shared stories of his life, how he had been born into slavery, escaped, and fought to make his way in a world that often saw him as less than human. He spoke of the struggles of growing up on a ranch where he was treated like property, where he learned the hard way that survival often meant fighting for your place in the world. They were two people from opposite worlds, yet there was a bond beginning to form, unspoken but undeniable. They were survivors, fighting against the odds, learning to trust in each other, if only for their shared need to live. But every night, when the stars appeared in the sky and the world around them settled into a fragile quiet. The reality of what they were doing would hit Dante like a stone in the gut. They were fugitives, hiding from the world, from people who would kill them both if they knew the truth. Etsali had been abandoned by her own tribe. She didn't know why. She only knew that those who had been sent to kill her were now her pursuers. And in a twisted way, Dante was now part of that equation. A new target in the eyes of both the Apache and the men who hunted them both. The thought lingered in the back of his mind as they moved from day to day, but he shoved it aside, unwilling to think too deeply about it. He had already made his choice, and there was no turning back. Then, one evening, while the campfire flickered and the sounds of the desert crept into the edges of their awareness, Etsali spoke again. "Why did you save me?" she asked, her voice soft, almost tentative. Dante paused, his hand resting on the fire, and looked into her eyes. They were dark and deep, filled with so many emotions he couldn't begin to understand. He had asked himself the same question 100 times, and still didn't have an answer. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I couldn't leave you. Not like that." Etsali didn't respond, but the quiet between them seemed to deepen. There was no judgment in her eyes now, no lingering mistrust. There was only understanding. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something that felt just as powerful. In that moment, Dante realized that this was the start of something neither of them could have predicted. The desert might be endless, but there was something between them now, a fragile thread that held them together in a world that had already torn them apart. They were still enemies, still bound by a past neither of them could escape, but in the silence of that night, it felt like they were beginning to heal. The days were blending together, a blur of dust and heat. The miles stretched before them like an endless expanse, unforgiving and raw. Dante had long since stopped counting the hours, focusing only on putting one foot in front of the other, keeping his eyes ahead, always on the lookout for any sign of danger. By now, Etsali had stopped fighting him. She'd started trusting him, though only a little. Her eyes softened when she looked at him, but there was still something guarded in the way she held herself. She was a warrior after all, and no matter how much she tried to suppress it, that warrior spirit was always there, ready to rise up. One morning, after a particularly grueling stretch of travel, they came upon a small, dilapidated settlement. It was the kind of place that the land had all but abandoned, a crumbling reminder of what had once been. The sun was relentless, the buildings were empty, and the air felt heavy with a sense of defeat. But it was shelter, at least for a while. Dante helped Etsali dismount, her legs unsteady, but she was getting stronger. He had made her drink more water than she wanted to, and now, as they entered the abandoned settlement, he could see the faintest hint of strength returning to her eyes. They found a crumbling barn just outside the main settlement. There, Dante set up camp, a small fire crackling in the corner. Etsali didn't say much, but the way she looked around made Dante feel the weight of the world pressing down on them both. "I'll find something to eat," Dante said, standing up and brushing the dirt off his pants. Etsali didn't respond immediately. She just sat, her eyes scanning the area. "You think we'll be safe here?" Her voice was quiet, and Dante could hear the skepticism in it. Dante paused for a moment. The truth was, he didn't know. They hadn't been safe for days, maybe even weeks now, but he had to believe there was some place where they could rest, somewhere that wouldn't lead to their immediate demise. He had to hope. "I'm not sure, but we've got no choice. We need to rest, just for a little while." He gave her a reassuring smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was protecting a fragile thread of hope. Hope that they could make it through this. That maybe, just maybe, there was a future for them. But those thoughts, the ones he hadn't dared to voice out loud, frightened him. While Dante went off to forage, Etsali sat in silence, her thoughts drifting to her father. He was the chief of the Chiricahua Apache, a man who had once been a great warrior. But now he was growing old, his power waning. Her heart ached for him, but it ached even more for the tribe, for her people who were being torn apart by the very things she had spent her life fighting against. She had grown up believing that the world was simple, that there were only enemies and allies, and that her people would fight until their last breath to preserve their way of life. But sitting here now, with Dante, her thoughts were tangled. Was he her enemy? Or was he just another man trying to survive just like her? As Dante returned with a few sparse supplies, Etsali glanced at him, her eyes meeting his. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was just comfortable. It was a kind of understanding that neither of them could name but both felt. "Thank you," she said quietly, as Dante set the food down in front of her. She didn't look at him as she spoke, but the words carried weight. She was beginning to understand him in ways she didn't want to. He wasn't just a cowboy. He wasn't just a man with a past full of bloodshed and loss. He was a man who had chosen to help her, even at the risk of his own life. "You don't have to thank me," Dante replied, settling beside her, his eyes glancing out at the empty, desolate horizon. "We're in this together, whether we like it or not." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the truth neither of them wanted to acknowledge. They were bound together now, for better or worse. But even as he spoke, Dante couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the world found out who he was with. Would Etsali still be his companion, his ally when the Apache came after her? Or would she turn on him, as so many people had before? His heart sank with the thought. He was already losing his grip on the life he had once known, the place he had once belonged. And in his heart, he knew the price of this journey was only just beginning to be paid. The days in the desert were beginning to wear on Dante. His muscles ached from the constant motion, from the endless vigilance required to keep Etsali safe. Each step felt heavier than the last, and he could sense the pressure mounting. Every time they encountered another stretch of barren land, he was reminded of the weight of their reality. They were fugitives, and there was no turning back. He had been living with the unspoken truth of his decision to help her. He didn't regret it. Not yet. But he was becoming more and more aware of the consequences that would follow. He couldn't outrun them forever. Soon the Apache would come looking for her, and they'd come looking for him too. One evening they were sitting by the fire, the flames flickering between them. Etsali had said little over the last few hours, her face unreadable. Dante could feel the tension between them, a kind of unspoken barrier that hadn't been there before. "Etsali, what happened to you?" Dante asked, his voice low, as he stirred the fire with a stick. He had been meaning to ask this question for days, but now, with the shadows growing longer and the night stretching out before them, he couldn't keep it inside anymore. She stiffened, her fingers clutching the blanket she had wrapped around her shoulders. For a moment, she didn't answer, the silence thick enough to suffocate them both. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "My people, my tribe, they wanted to kill me." Dante felt a pang in his chest, though he tried to mask it. He didn't know why, but hearing those words hit him harder than he had expected. "Why?" he asked, the question leaving his mouth before he could stop it. She turned away from him, her dark eyes fixed on the distance. There was a long, painful pause before she responded. When she did, her voice was filled with a bitterness that almost seemed foreign to her. "Because I refused to fight for them," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My father wanted war, wanted to keep killing, but I saw the damage. I knew it wouldn't end. The cycle would never end. So I left. I didn't want to be part of it anymore." Dante watched her closely, trying to digest her words. He had heard of Apache raids, of the wars between their people, but he hadn't known the personal cost of it all. It had always been easy to look at the conflict from a distance, to see it in terms of battles and enemies, but now it was real. Now, it was personal. Etsali let out a long breath, her body relaxing slightly. "But when I left, they said I was a traitor, that I'd turned my back on my people. They tried to kill me for it." Dante felt his heart twist. He didn't know what to say. He had no words for the pain she must have felt, for the weight of betrayal that had been thrust upon her, not just by her people, but by the very thing she had tried to escape. "That's why I don't trust anyone," she added, her voice quieter now. "I've seen what loyalty can do, what it can destroy." Dante was silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of her words. He knew what loyalty was. He had been loyal to Jedediah Stone, the ranch owner who had taken him in after his escape from slavery. But even with that loyalty, he had always felt like an outsider, like a tool. He understood now, in the pit of his stomach, that loyalty could be a double-edged sword. It could keep you bound to a life you didn't want. It could keep you fighting battles that weren't yours. "I'm not asking you to trust me," Dante finally said, his voice steady, despite the emotions churning inside him. "But I am asking you to survive. We can't keep running forever. If we're going to get through this, we need each other. Etsali looked at him then, her eyes searching his face as if weighing his words. He could see the skepticism in her eyes, but there was something else there too, something like understanding. For the first time, Etsali didn't look away. She didn't pull back. Instead, she gave a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "All right," she said softly. "But if you betray me, I'll make sure you regret it." Dante smiled, though it was a rueful smile. He had never been afraid of dying, but the thought of losing the fragile connection they were beginning to build was something else entirely. "I won't betray you," he said quietly. "I'm not like them." For a long while, the two of them sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. The world outside was still, and the desert stretched on endlessly. But in that moment, Dante felt a flicker of something more, something beyond survival, something that felt like the beginning of hope. The days were growing longer, and Dante could feel the tension thickening around them like a suffocating fog. They had been on the move for nearly 2 weeks now, traveling through barren stretches of desert, and each step seemed to carry them further from safety and closer to danger. Dante had been trained to survive, to never back down. But this was different. He wasn't just surviving for himself anymore. Etsali had become more than just a responsibility to him. She had become a part of his fight, his reason to keep moving, to keep going, even when the odds were stacked against them. But the desert was relentless, and so was the threat that loomed behind them. The Apache warriors who had been hunting Etsali were still out there, just waiting for the right moment to strike. The two of them were holed up in a small cave, the shadows of the evening creeping in as they settled by the fire. Dante had been scouting ahead, always watching for signs of pursuit, but there was something different in the air tonight. A stillness that made his instincts scream. He knew they were close. He could feel it in his bones. Etsali had been quiet all day, lost in her thoughts, her eyes distant. She had grown stronger, but the weight of what had happened, the betrayal by her own people, still haunted her. Dante could see it in the way she held herself, in the way she avoided looking him directly in the eyes. "Etsali," Dante said softly, breaking the silence. "We can't keep running forever. Sooner or later, we'll have to make a stand." She didn't respond at first, her gaze fixed on the fire. Dante watched her, waiting for an answer, but all he got was silence. "I know you don't want to hear it, but we can't hide from the world forever," Dante continued, his voice steady but filled with the urgency he could no longer ignore. "We need to face what's coming, together." Her head snapped up, and for a moment, Dante saw the anger in her eyes, the flicker of the warrior that was always there beneath the surface. "You don't understand," she spat, her voice hoarse. "You don't know what it's like to be hunted by your own people, to be branded a traitor, to be thrown aside like I was." Dante's chest tightened. He had seen that look before. The same look that haunted his own past. The look of someone who had been forced to fight for survival, who had been torn apart by the very people they once called family. "I may not know exactly what you've been through," Dante said quietly, his voice soft but firm. "But I do know what it's like to be betrayed, to be discarded. And that's why I'm still here. Because I don't believe in leaving people behind." Etsali stood abruptly, her back to him, the firelight casting long shadows on her face. "I didn't ask for your help. I didn't want it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But you didn't give me a choice. Now we're both stuck in this mess. And I don't know how to fix it." Dante stood up as well, his eyes never leaving her. He knew she was angry, knew she didn't want to rely on him. But the truth was, she didn't have to. She had already saved him too, in ways he couldn't fully explain. The fact that they were still alive, still together, was proof enough of that. "Etsali," he said again, his voice gentler now. "We don't have to fix everything right away, but we can try, and we can fight." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning, the weight of everything that had come before and everything that was yet to come. Etsali turned slowly to face him, her eyes filled with something Dante hadn't seen there before: vulnerability. For the first time, Etsali let out a soft sigh and nodded. "All right," she said, her voice small but resolute. "Let's fight." They didn't say anything more after that. The words weren't necessary. In that simple exchange, a shift had happened, a quiet understanding between them. No longer were they just two people thrown together by fate. They were allies, bound together by a common struggle, and for the first time in a long time, they had a shared purpose. As they sat by the fire that night, Dante couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time in days, he wasn't thinking about what was chasing them, about the danger that was always one step behind. Instead, he was thinking about the future, about what they could build together if they made it through this. The next morning, they broke camp early. Dante led Etsali toward a ridge, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. It was then that he saw them, riders in the distance, moving in a tight formation, slowly making their way toward them. He turned to Etsali, his heart pounding in his chest. "They're here." She looked at him, her expression hardening. She was ready. They both were. "We fight then," she said, her voice steady, filled with a warrior's resolve. "We face this together." As they prepared for what was to come, Dante couldn't help but think about how far they had come. From enemies to reluctant allies, and now they were something more, something stronger. And in that moment, he knew that no matter what happened, they wouldn't be alone. The desert had no mercy, and neither did the men who pursued them. Dante had always known this day would come, the day when the world would catch up to them. The sounds of hooves pounding the earth echoed in his ears, a reminder that no matter how far they ran, the past was always waiting for them. Etsali had been watching the horizon when she first spotted them. Apache warriors, their faces set in grim determination, riding hard in pursuit. At the head of the group was Kyle, her cousin, the man who had betrayed her. The thought of facing him made her stomach twist in knots. But the realization that she was running out of time hit her even harder. There was no more running. Dante noticed the change in her stance before she spoke. "We're being hunted," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, deadly resolve. "I know," Dante replied, his voice tight. His eyes scanned the landscape, trying to assess their options. But the truth was simple. They didn't have many. The Apache riders were closing in, their horses kicking up dust as they moved with swift precision. Dante could feel the tension in the air, thick with the knowledge that the showdown was inevitable. He could almost feel the weight of the decisions that were about to unfold. They were about to face a battle that neither of them had chosen, and yet, here they were, together, standing in the middle of it. "We need to make a stand," Etsali said, her voice steady but filled with something Dante couldn't quite place. Fear, yes, but also something else, something deeper. "This fight isn't just for my life. It's for everything that comes after." Dante didn't need her to explain. He understood. This was about the future, about surviving long enough to have a future. And that was something he couldn't afford to lose. As the Apache riders drew closer, Dante took a deep breath and turned to Etsali, his eyes meeting hers. There was no time for hesitation, no time for second thoughts. "Get ready," he said. "We'll fight together, or we'll die together." Etsali's gaze hardened, and she nodded, her hand gripping the hilt of the knife at her side. It wasn't the first time she had faced death, but something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the man standing beside her, the one who had chosen to fight for her, to protect her, even though she was supposed to be his enemy. The first shots rang out before Dante even had time to react. The Apache riders had seen them, and they weren't wasting any time. Dante grabbed his rifle, his fingers moving quickly but sure. He fired, the sound of the shot sharp in the still desert air. One of the riders fell, but the others didn't slow down. They were closing in, and there was no way to outrun them now. Etsali moved with a grace and power that Dante had come to expect from her. She was an Apache warrior, trained for moments like this, but even she could feel the weight of the situation. Her body was tired, worn down from the journey, but her resolve was unshakable. The battle erupted into chaos. Dust kicked up, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. Dante fought with everything he had, each shot carefully aimed, each movement calculated. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. He couldn't afford to lose. But then, as the battle raged on, a familiar figure emerged from the dust. Kyle, her cousin, the man who had once been family, rode forward, his eyes locked on Etsali with a look of pure malice. "Etsali!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the din of the fight. "You betrayed your people. You left us, and now you'll pay for it." Dante's heart skipped a beat. He knew what this meant. Kyle wasn't just here for her. He was here to end this, once and for all. Etsali's hand tightened on the hilt of her knife, her eyes narrowing as she faced her cousin. But Dante could see the hesitation in her stance. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for her very soul. Kyle laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. You think you can escape your past? You think you can run forever? Before Etsali could react, Dante moved in front of her, his body a shield between her and Kyle. The world seemed to slow as he stood there, facing down the man who had once been a part of his world, the man who had brought all of this to a head. You don't get to decide who survives, Dante said, his voice firm, carrying a weight of authority that even Kyle couldn't ignore. We all have a choice, and this isn't yours to make. Kyle sneered. You're just a dog who doesn't know his place. Dante's fingers tightened on the rifle. He didn't need to hear another word. This fight wasn't just about Etsali anymore. It was about everything that had led him to this moment. The choices, the betrayals, the alliances. With one swift motion, Dante fired. The sound of the shot echoed across the desert, a thunderous crack that seemed to split the world in two. Kyle fell, his body crumpling to the ground in a heap of dust and blood. For a long moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of the wind and the crackling fire. Dante stood there, his heart racing, his mind reeling with what had just happened. He had killed Kyle, the man who had been a threat to both of them. But in that moment, the weight of his actions settled on him like 1,000 stones. He had chosen a side, and it was Etsali's side. The sun had barely begun to rise the next morning when Dante and Etsali began their journey once more. The sounds of the battle had faded, but the weight of what had just happened hung between them, an unspoken tension that neither of them could ignore. Etsali was still shaken, her movements slower than before. Despite the victory, despite Kyle's death, she couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. For years, she had been raised to believe that loyalty to her people was everything. Now, the only person left who had shown her loyalty was the man who had been her enemy. Dante's decision to stand between her and Kyle had meant everything. Yet, it also meant that her past, her tribe, her heritage, had been torn away in an instant. Dante, on the other hand, was struggling with his own turmoil. Killing Kyle had been necessary. It had been a matter of survival, of protecting Etsali. But it had also meant that he had made a choice that cut him off from the only world he had ever known. The ranch, Jedediah Stone, the life he had once accepted, all of that was gone. There was no going back now. Despite the gravity of their situation, Dante didn't show it. He kept his face impassive as always. He had learned long ago that emotions would only slow you down, get you killed. But as he looked at Etsali, he couldn't help but feel that she was the first person who had ever truly seen him. Not just the man who had survived, but the man who was willing to risk everything for what was right. You don't have to follow me, Dante said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with an honesty that surprised him. You could still leave. Go back to your people. Etsali's eyes flickered to him, a sharpness in her gaze that he had come to respect. I don't belong to them anymore. You know that. But I also know I can't do this alone. Her voice was soft but resolute, and in that moment, Dante saw something in her that he hadn't expected. a willingness to face the unknown, a willingness to fight for a future that neither of them could see clearly. He had never imagined that he would become part of something bigger than himself. But now, it seemed that the desert had a way of forcing you to confront the things you would have otherwise avoided. As they moved through the rocky terrain, they began to talk more about their pasts, their lives, and the people they had lost along the way. Etsali shared the details of her escape, how she had left her tribe because of a disagreement over their path forward, and how she had been cast out for it. She spoke of her father, the chief, a man torn between the old ways and the desperate need to protect his people in a world that was growing increasingly hostile. Dante listened carefully, his mind processing the pieces of her story, understanding now more than ever the burden she carried. She was caught between two worlds, unable to return to her past, yet unwilling to embrace the future without her people. But even as they talked, there was still an unspoken divide between them. Dante had been raised in a world of hatred and fear, while Etsali had been raised to fight, to protect her people at all costs. Both of them had been shaped by circumstances beyond their control. Yet, despite that divide, there was an undeniable connection, a shared struggle to survive. As they neared a small village in the distance, a settlement that looked like it had been untouched by time, Etsali stopped suddenly, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the horizon. "What's wrong?" Dante asked, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. "I think we're being followed," she said, her voice low, tension evident in her every movement. "There are tracks." Dante cursed under his breath. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it so soon. The Apache riders who had been chasing them, Kyle's men, were closing in, and there was nowhere to run anymore. "We have to make it to that village," Dante said, his voice firm. "It's our only shot." Without another word, they both broke into a run, heading toward the village with all the urgency they could muster. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground as they pushed forward, their hearts racing, adrenaline fueling them. When they reached the village, they found it abandoned, the small adobe houses falling apart under the weight of neglect. But there was shelter there, at least for a moment. They ducked into one of the empty homes, staying low, listening for the sound of approaching hooves. "We'll stay here for the night," Dante said, his eyes scanning the empty streets. "We don't have much time." Etsali nodded, her eyes sharp. She was already thinking ahead, already calculating their next move. She was a survivor, just like him. And in that moment, Dante realized that they weren't just two people thrown together by fate. They were a team. As night fell, they sat in silence, the sounds of the desert stretching out into the darkness. The fire they had built crackled softly, but it was the quiet between them that spoke the loudest. There was no turning back now. They had made their choice, and now they had to face the consequences together. The night passed in a tense silence. Dante and Etsali took turns watching the shadows, each listening for the telltale sounds of pursuers. The flicker of their campfire danced, casting long, jagged shadows along the walls of the dilapidated house they had taken refuge in. The world outside felt distant, but they both knew that danger was near. As the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the walls, Dante stood up, his muscles stiff from the night spent alert. Etsali was already awake, her eyes sharp as she checked the surroundings. "We need to move," Dante said, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency. "We can't stay here much longer." Etsali nodded silently, her gaze lingering on the distant horizon. She knew what they were facing. If Kyle and his men found them here, there would be no escape. The only option was to fight, to stand their ground. "I don't want to run anymore," she said, her voice steady, though the tension in her body was palpable. "Let's face them. We've been running long enough." Dante turned to face her, surprised by the fire in her voice. He had known she was strong, but hearing her speak with such conviction filled him with a sense of solidarity, a sense that they were no longer two strangers thrown together by fate. They were allies, bound by the struggle for survival. "We'll fight then," Dante said, his voice low but resolute. "But we fight on our terms, not theirs." He moved quickly, gathering their meager supplies. Etsali followed his lead, but her mind was working faster than her hands. She had fought before, in battles where life and death were decided in the blink of an eye. But this was different. The fight they were about to face wasn't just about survival. It was about the future, about making a stand against everything that had torn their worlds apart. "We'll use the terrain to our advantage," Dante said as he glanced over his shoulder. "Get to higher ground. Make them come to us. That's the only way we'll have a chance." As they made their way to a small ridge overlooking the valley below, Dante could feel his pulse quicken. His hand instinctively went to the rifle strapped to his back. This was the moment they had been dreading, the moment when they would no longer be running, but fighting for their lives. "Are you ready?" Dante asked, his voice quiet, but filled with determination. Etsali turned to him, her eyes blazing with a fire that mirrored his own. "I was born ready," she said, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. Together, they took their positions on the ridge, crouching low to the ground, their rifles aimed down at the valley below. The sounds of approaching riders were faint, but they were getting closer. Dante's grip tightened on his rifle, and Etsali adjusted her stance, every muscle in her body coiled and ready. The first Apache rider appeared on the horizon, followed by a few more. Kyle was with them, his face twisted into a grimace of determination. Dante could see the hate in his eyes, but there was something else there too, something like fear. "Here they come," Etsali said, her voice calm but filled with the intensity of the moment. Dante nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Wait for my signal." He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him, and for the first time since he'd made the decision to save her, he understood the full extent of what he was doing. This wasn't just about him or Etsali anymore. It was about choosing the kind of world they wanted to live in. A world where hatred and fear didn't control their destinies. A world where they could make their own choices. The Apache riders drew closer, their eyes scanning the ridge, their weapons drawn. Dante could feel the tension building. He could hear the sound of their hooves pounding the earth, the air thick with the promise of violence. When Kyle reached the base of the ridge, Dante stood, rifle aimed squarely at him. "Stop right there!" Dante called out, his voice carrying across the still morning air. "This ends now." Kyle looked up, surprise flashing across his face before it was replaced by fury. "You think you can stop me, cowboy?" he sneered, drawing his own rifle. "I'm not stopping you," Dante said. "I'm giving you a chance. Turn around and leave. There's no reason for this to go any further." But Kyle wasn't listening. With a shout, he spurred his horse forward, and the riders behind him followed suit. The battle had begun. The first shot rang out, and everything fell into chaos. Dante fired, his shot ringing true. One of the Apache riders fell, but the others surged forward, their horses charging up the ridge. Etsali was beside him, her knife drawn, her movements swift and deadly. They fought with everything they had. Dante fired again, hitting another rider, but the sound of hooves grew louder, closer. Kyle was determined, his men pushing forward, but Dante wasn't about to back down. Neither of them was. For a brief moment, it felt like the world had stopped, like the desert was holding its breath. And then, with a deafening roar, the world erupted. Kyle was charging at them, his eyes wild with fury, his rifle raised. Etsali darted forward, using her agility to move faster than the eye could follow. Her knife flashed in the sunlight, and with a final, determined thrust, she drove it into Kyle's chest. He staggered back, blood spilling from his wound, his eyes wide with disbelief. But there was no mercy in his gaze. With one last breath, he crumpled to the ground. The dust of battle settled, but the air was still thick with tension. Dante stood over the fallen form of Kyle, his heart hammering in his chest. The fight was over, but the consequences of what they had just done would echo in their lives forever. The desert, which had been their endless battleground, now felt strangely quiet. Etsali stood a few feet away, her breathing heavy but controlled. She was looking at the body of her cousin, her expression unreadable. The anger in her eyes was gone, replaced by something else, something Dante couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps, or maybe the beginning of acceptance. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The reality of the situation was still sinking in, both the victory and the loss. Dante could feel the weight of the choice he had made, the choice to protect Etsali, to stand by her, to defend her. But in doing so, he had severed his connection to everything he had ever known, everything that had once been his world. Kyle's death wasn't just the end of a fight. It was the end of a part of himself that Dante wasn't sure he could ever recover. Etsali finally broke the silence. Her voice was soft, almost fragile. "I never wanted this," she said, her gaze still fixed on the lifeless body of Kyle. "I never wanted to see him like this." Dante didn't know what to say. He had seen the pain in her eyes when she spoke of her tribe, of her father, and the blood that had been spilled in the name of loyalty. And now she was standing here, dealing with the consequences of that loyalty. Kyle had been her family. Despite everything that had happened, he had been her flesh and blood. "You didn't have a choice," Dante said gently, stepping closer to her. "Neither of us did. This was the only way." Etsali didn't look at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just him. It's the whole cycle. The fighting, the bloodshed. It doesn't end. It never ends." Dante watched her, his heart aching. He understood. He understood because he had lived that cycle too, had fought against it for his whole life. He knew the weight of living in a world that demanded loyalty at the cost of everything else. But what he couldn't understand was why, after all this, Etsali was still standing, why she was still fighting. Etsali turned to him, her eyes filled with something new, something softer, more vulnerable. "Why didn't you leave me?" she asked, her voice raw with emotion. "Why didn't you just let me go?" The question cut through Dante like a blade. He hadn't been prepared for it, hadn't even considered how to answer it. But he knew the truth. He had never considered leaving her behind, not even for a moment. "Because I couldn't," Dante said simply. "Because I couldn't let you die out there. You matter more than that." Etsali blinked, her eyes suddenly glistening. It was a moment of raw honesty, one that both of them had been avoiding for far too long. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the cracks in her armor were becoming more visible. She had been carrying the weight of her people's expectations, the weight of betrayal and guilt. But now she was standing here, in a world where she didn't have to fight alone anymore. "Dante," she began, her voice breaking slightly, but she didn't finish her sentence. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the gap between them. He looked down at her, his heart pounding. The air between them felt charged, electric, as if everything they had been through, the battles, the betrayals, the unspoken words, had led them to this moment. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, but it was no longer uncomfortable. There was something between them now that hadn't been there before, a bond forged in the fire of survival, of choosing each other despite the odds. And then she reached up, her hand trembling as she touched his face. The gentleness of the gesture made Dante's breath catch. "I don't know what happens next," Etsali whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "But I know this. I'm not alone anymore." Dante stood still, overwhelmed by the depth of her words. He had spent his life fighting for survival, fighting to carve out a place for himself in a world that had never given him a chance. But now, for the first time, he felt like he had found that place. With her. "You're not alone," Dante replied, his voice steady and strong. "And neither am I." Without saying another word, he pulled her into an embrace, holding her close as the weight of everything they had been through pressed down on them both. The world outside could wait for a while. For this moment, It was just the two of them. And for the first time in a long time, Dante allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for them, for their future. As they stood there, in the silence of the desert, the sound of their breathing the only thing between them, Dante knew one thing with absolute certainty. No matter what came next, he would fight for this, fight for her, for them. The days that followed were quiet, but not peaceful. Dante and Etsali continued their journey, but now it was different. There was a calmness between them, an understanding that hadn't been there before. The world outside still felt like it was pushing in on them, but inside their shared silence, there was a peace that neither of them had known for a long time. They didn't talk much, but the unspoken words between them spoke volumes. The sun was still relentless, the desert stretching out in every direction, but there was something in the air now, a subtle shift, a spark of something new, something more than just survival. Dante had been carrying the weight of his past for so long, and Etsali had been burdened with the weight of her people's expectations. But now, for the first time, they felt like they were moving forward, not just physically, but emotionally, together. As they made their way toward a small town on the edge of the desert, Dante couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that was loud and brash. It was softer, like the first light of dawn breaking through the darkness. He didn't know what the future held for them, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to face it, whatever it was. And he knew that Etsali was too. When they arrived at the town, it was small, just a handful of buildings clustered together, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the desert. But it was a town, and that meant safety. It meant a chance to rest, to heal, to figure out what came next. Dante and Etsali stood at the edge of the town, looking out over it. There was still a wariness in Etsali's eyes, but it wasn't the kind of distrust that had been there before. This was different. They were both tired, worn down by everything they had been through, but they had made it this far, and that was something. "We made it," Dante said, his voice quiet, but filled with conviction. Etsali didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out at the horizon, the weight of everything that had happened and everything that could happen next pressing on her shoulders. She had fought for so long, running from the past, running from her people, running from the bloodshed. And now, for the first time, she felt like she could breathe. "We made it," she repeated softly, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. The world around them was still, but inside there was a storm brewing, a storm of possibilities, of choices, of what came next. They had survived, together. But surviving was only the beginning. "We have a choice now," Dante said, his voice low, as if the words were still new to him, like he was testing them out for the first time. "We can make this what we want it to be." Etsali turned to him, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time there was no fear in her gaze, just understanding. understanding that despite everything that had happened, they could still make something of this, still choose their own path. "And what do you want?" Etsali asked, her voice calm, but her eyes searching his. Dante didn't hesitate. "I want to build something, a place where we can live without fear, without hate, a place where there's hope." The words hung between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was a simple dream, one that had been buried under the weight of their pasts for so long. But now, with the world stretched out before them, it seemed possible. It seemed real. "I want that too," Etsali said quietly. "I've fought so hard for so long. I never thought I'd have the chance to choose, to live." Dante smiled, a small, genuine smile. He reached out, gently brushing her hand with his, and in that simple touch, they both felt it. The connection they had forged, the bond that had been created between them through their shared struggle. "We'll build it together," Dante said, his voice firm with the certainty that he hadn't known he had in him. "No more running, no more fighting alone." Etsali nodded, her heart swelling with something that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Hope for the future, for what was to come. They had come so far, and now it was time to move forward. Together. As they walked into the small town, side by side, they both knew that the journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, still obstacles to overcome. But for the first time, they were no longer fighting just to survive. They were fighting for something more. They were fighting for each other, for a future built on trust, on love, and on hope. And as they entered the town, the sun rising higher in the sky, they felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The sun was setting as Dante and Etsali sat on the porch of their cabin, the peacefulness of the desert surrounding them. It had been weeks since they arrived in the small town, and everything felt quieter now. Different. They had found work, settled into a routine, and most importantly, found peace. Etsali looked out over the horizon, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "I never thought this would be possible," she said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. "A life like this. No running anymore." Dante turned to her, a contented smile on his face. "We've earned it," he said, his voice steady yet warm. "After everything we've been through, this is ours." They had both lived with the constant weight of their pasts, but now, for the first time, they had the chance to create something new together. Etsali had started helping the people in the town, offering her knowledge of healing. Dante worked on the ranch, helping to maintain the land and care for the cattle. Life was hard, but it was no longer filled with fear or constant running. "What happens next?" Etsali asked, her voice softer now, filled with hope and uncertainty. Dante looked toward the horizon, where the sun was sinking, casting its final light over the desert. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life he wasn't afraid of it. I don't know, he said, but I know that we're not alone anymore, and we don't have to face whatever comes next by ourselves. The simple truth between them was enough. They had found something worth fighting for, a future, together. As Etsali leaned her head against Dante's shoulder, they both let out a sigh of relief. The past was behind them. They had each other, and that was enough. The future, whatever it held, was theirs to shape. As Dante and Etsali build a life free from fear, their journey reminds us that no matter the struggles we face, there's always hope for a better tomorrow. Together, they found love, peace, and the strength to rise above the past. This story is a testament to the power of human connection and resilience. If you've enjoyed this heartfelt tale of redemption and survival, please give us a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us all of the enduring power of love and hope. The sun was setting as Dante and Etsali sat on the porch of their cabin, the peacefulness of the desert surrounding them. It had been weeks since they arrived in the small town, and everything felt quieter now. Different. They had found work, settled into a routine, and most importantly, found peace. Etsali looked out over the horizon, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "I never thought this would be possible," she said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. "A life like this. No running anymore." Dante turned to her, a contented smile on his face. "We've earned it," he said, his voice steady yet warm. "After everything we've been through, this is ours." They had both lived with the constant weight of their pasts, but now, for the first time, they had the chance to create something new together. Etsali had started helping the people in the town, offering her knowledge of healing. Dante worked on the ranch, helping to maintain the land and care for the cattle. Life was hard, but it was no longer filled with fear or constant running. "What happens next?" Etsali asked, her voice softer now, filled with hope and uncertainty. Dante looked toward the horizon, where the sun was sinking, casting its final light over the desert. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life he wasn't afraid of it. "I don't know," he said, "but I know that we're not alone anymore, and we don't have to face whatever comes next by ourselves." The simple truth between them was enough. They had found something worth fighting for, a future, together. As Etsali leaned her head against Dante's shoulder, they both let out a sigh of relief. The past was behind them. They had each other, and that was enough. The future, whatever it held, was theirs to shape. As Dante and Etsali build a life free from fear, their journey reminds us that no matter the struggles we face, there's always hope for a better tomorrow. Together, they found love, peace, and the strength to rise above the past. This story is a testament to the power of human connection and resilience. If you've enjoyed this heartfelt tale of redemption and survival, please give us a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us all of the enduring power of love and hope.